India looks set to use trade as its weapon of choice in its border dispute with China. New Delhi is planning to block investment and to increase tariffs. A high-level meeting has reportedly been called to discuss the details and the extent of the response. Well, it's likely trade, investment and project services that will be targeted. And there could also be restrictions on the involvement of Chinese firms in government contracts and infrastructure projects, plus higher tariffs on Chinese products. And there are also renewed calls from Indians to boycott Chinese goods. Imports from China added up to $70 billion last year, more than from any other country. And Chinese companies also hold a big share of India's mobile phone and electronics markets.
Well, for more on the intricacies of Indo-China trade relations, let's speak now with Dr. Amitendu Palit. He's Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead at the Institute of South Asian Studies at NUS here in Singapore. Good evening, Dr. Palit. Thank you for joining us here this evening. These two giants, the history of their relations with trade, it goes back some way. So put into perspective here something about just how reliant they are on each other.
What you say is absolutely right. They have been trading with each other for centuries, which goes back to the opium trade and then the vestiges of a colonial trade expansion across the world. But in more recent years, the trade relationship, while it's been large in terms of volume, but the character of the relationship has been somewhat very, very prominently one-sided. Roughly $87 billion of total trade that makes China India's topmost trade partner, right on par with the United States of America, probably separated by a few millions. But the trade deficit is pretty high, which has been a matter of concern with India for several years. The trade deficit is almost at $54 billion. So, which basically means that India imports from China far, far more than it actually exports to that country, and which in a sense has heightened anxieties over India's very serious dependence on China for imports. It's kind of a broad-based dependence. And coming on the back of a series of immediate concerns, the latest of which is the provocation in the Indian Himalayan state of Ladakh. There are calls, there are views, there are specific moves to ensure that the government takes steps and measures and the industry gets ready to reduce the dependence on China, because such dependence, in a sense, probably the feeling is it makes India hostage to a number of factors which it wouldn't like it didn't want to be held hostage to, and it wants to have a better negotiating space and level playing field so that it can stand up to China in as many respects as possible.
Exactly, perhaps on a level playing field. But you're speaking of this reduction, Dr. Palit, Indian government says that it plans to impose higher trade barriers and raise import duties on around 300 products from China. How quickly do you see this happening?
Well, given the current state of situation, I wouldn't be surprised if it happens quite fast, because there are already some developments that have been happening in terms of Chinese telecom equipment providers to Indian major telecom users are already being told that Indian companies should refrain from using this upgraded 4G equipment as far as telecom is concerned. And there are also other efforts being on. You see, this also needs to be looked at in the broader context of India trying to reduce its overall import dependency and going towards a dedicated vision of what's called a self-reliant India, though in a very, very large sense of the term, that probably means pushing a dedicated policy of import substitution and turning inward. But I sense that much of it also has to do with the fact that for India, it's not just a reliance on imports, but it's more principally a reliance on Chinese imports. So it's a combination of anxiety, it's a combination of economic inward-looking policies which are driving this force. And I wouldn't be surprised if the tariffs and trade barriers kick in pretty soon.
Dr. Palit, taking that into consideration, China is likely to retaliate in that scenario, but how soon could that happen? Which sectors do you see being impacted the most here?
I think it's a very interesting point that you raise. I think this entire trade hostility is actually not going to benefit any side. It depends on how they get affected at what stages. For China, India is a very big market. And at a point in time when global trade is shrinking, regional trade is coming down, and a country like India offers enormous export opportunities to China, as it has been for several years. India has not joined the RCEP, so it's all the more important that Chinese products continue to get access to the Indian market. So maybe when India reacts with trade barriers, that might not be very good news for Chinese producers as such. But on the other hand, let's not forget the fact that there are several broad-based requirements that India has from China in terms of imports across a wide range of capital goods, including electrical machinery, automobile parts and components, antibiotics, for example, which are widely used by India's generic drug making industry, semiconductor machines. So these requirements need to be fulfilled by India, and raising of tariffs are going to make these imports expensive. So India needs to take a call as to for how long it will be prepared to take these expensive hits for the economy. I guess the ostensible reason will be to check if these imports could be substituted from other sources. I'm not sure whether that will be possible very quickly or overnight. But what I mean to say is that overall, this is going to be injurious to both sides in terms of certain sectoral impacts, in terms of certain overall impacts. And I guess for the trading environment in Asia-Pacific region at large, this is not particularly good news, because the China-India trade is of a fairly large volume. And there are sectors and actors depending on the expansion of such trade, including the shipping industry and the financial industry, for example. So it's not particularly good news for them.
And no doubt a trade war between these two giants wouldn't bode well for any economy in this region. Dr. Palit, thank you very much for that perspective you've shared with us tonight. That was Dr. Amitendu Palit from the National University of Singapore.